What if the person you always dismissed as too quiet has already predicted exactly how your life is going to unfold and chose not to say a word? Think about that for a second. There's someone in your world, maybe a coworker, maybe a friend, maybe the person staring back at you in the mirror, who rarely speaks first, rarely fights for attention, and never seems rushed. And yet, somehow, every single time the dust settles, they were right. Every time the crowd zigged, they had already zagged. Every time the world caught up to a new reality, they were already waiting there, completely unsurprised. People call it wisdom. Some call it luck. Others get uncomfortable and call it something they can't quite name. But neuroscience has a name for it. Today, we're going inside the skull of one of the rarest, most misread, most quietly powerful minds on the planet, the INTJ. Because what researchers have uncovered about how this brain actually processes reality doesn't just explain why they seem ahead of everyone else. It reveals something genuinely extraordinary about human cognition itself. We're calling it the Oracle pattern. It's real, it's measurable, and by the time this ends, you're either going to understand someone in your life on a level you never did before, or you're finally going to understand yourself. 1 mind in 50. Start with the math because it sets up everything else. INTJs sit among the rarest types on the personality spectrum. Most estimates put them at around 1 to 2% of the population. Sit in a packed lecture hall of 200 people, and statistically, you might find 2 or 3 INTJs scattered across the whole room. That scarcity does something to a person. Grow up as the only kid in class who thinks 5 steps past everyone else, and you learn fast that most people aren't running the same software. You stop waiting for the room to catch up. You stop explaining your reasoning line by line because nobody's asking for it, and the other half wouldn't follow it anyway. Eventually, silence feels more efficient than translation. This framework traces back to Carl Jung, who first proposed that people default to fundamentally different ways of taking in and processing the world. Decades later, Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers shaped that raw theory into the type system most of us recognize today. INTJ, introverted, intuitive, thinking, judging, lands at one of the system's furthest edges, building a mind far more interested in the pattern sitting underneath reality than in the surface conversation about it. 2. The prediction engine running 24/7. Here's a concept most people have never heard of, but it changes everything once you understand it. Predictive coding. Predictive coding is the brain's master operating system. Every brain uses it. Rather than passively receiving information from the world and reacting, which would be far too slow, the brain constantly generates predictions about what's going to happen next. It builds an internal model of reality, runs it forward in time, and then compares incoming data against the model. When there's a match, it barely notices. When there's a mismatch, it updates, and that update is what we experience as surprise, learning, or insight. In most people, this system operates at a relatively shallow level. The brain predicts physical objects, familiar faces, expected social scripts, the surface layer of reality, and then it stops. In the INTJ brain, this system runs several layers deeper. Their predictive engine doesn't just model physical reality, it models complex systems, organizational behavior, long-term relationship trajectories, the downstream consequences of decisions being made today. It runs simulations not of what happens next physically, but what happens next causally, tracing chains of influence across time and through layers of complexity that most minds never reach. Think of it this way: your GPS predicts the next turn. The INTJ's brain predicts the entire road network, including the traffic pattern that hasn't formed yet. This is why their predictions feel almost supernatural. It's not that they have information others don't. It's that they're doing more with the same information. 3. The silent lab inside their head. Every INTJ runs on something called Introverted Intuition, NI for short, and it functions less like a thought and more like a compass needle that never fully settles. It's constantly cross-referencing whatever's happening right now against every pattern the person has ever stored away, hunting for a match. Most people's intuition faces outward. It reacts to the room in real time, a shift in tone, a raised eyebrow, a joke that landed wrong. INTJs run the opposite direction. Their intuition works from the inside out, quietly asking a single recurring question: where has this exact shape shown up before, and where did it lead last time? Deep inside the brain, there's a network of regions that activates not when you're focused on an external task, but when you're not, when you daydream, when your mind drifts, when you're in the shower or lying awake at 2 a.m. Scientists call this the default mode network, and for a long time they thought it was just the brain idling, noise between the real processing. They were wrong. The DMN is where the brain does some of its deepest, most sophisticated work. It's where you simulate possible futures, reconstruct the past, and make sense of your place in the larger story of your life. It's not idle activity. It's internal architecture work. In most people, the DMN and the executive control network have a push-pull relationship. One goes up, the other goes down. In INTJs, this seesaw doesn't work the same way. Their dominant function, NI, is inherently inward-facing and future-oriented, so their DMN stays unusually active even during analytical tasks. They've developed something close to dual network processing, running internal simulations at the same time as conscious analysis. That's why conversations with an INTJ can feel like they've skipped 3 chapters. Their brain already sprinted 5 moves ahead and landed on a conclusion. Backfilling every step feels like a waste of time, theirs included. When the INTJ stares out the window appearing to do nothing, they are, neurologically speaking, doing an extraordinary amount. The silent lab never closes. 4. Signal over static. One of the most reliably strange things about INTJs, the thing that quietly unsettles people who spend enough time around them, is how often they turn out to be right. Not always, not about everything, but in their domains, their predictions carry an accuracy that eventually stops feeling like luck. What's behind it? Signal discrimination, and it's something the INTJ brain does better than almost any other cognitive profile. Every moment of every day, the brain is flooded with information. Most of it is noise, irrelevant data, social static, emotional interference, cognitive bias. Most people's filters are shaped by emotion and social expectation, meaning they let through a lot of distortion alongside the signal. The INTJ brain, through the interplay of dominant NI and auxiliary TE, runs a much tighter filter. Incoming information gets stripped of emotional charge and surface appearance before processing. What's left is structural pattern, the actual shape of what's happening, free of the noise clouding most people's judgment. Then TE demands the pattern be tested, validated against logical structure and real-world evidence, not just accepted on feel. The result is a mind genuinely less subject to wishful thinking, social conformity bias, and the pressure to agree with whoever's in the room. The signal is what it is. That's not arrogance. That's neuroscience. 5. The loneliness built into the wiring. This part doesn't get talked about honestly very often, but it's neurologically real, and it deserves to be said plainly. The INTJ brain's depth of processing creates a persistent, structural gap between how they experience the world and how almost everyone around them does. They're not just thinking differently, they're inhabiting a different layer of reality. A layer where the implications of today's decisions ripple forward clearly, where patterns that haven't completed yet are already visible, where the subtext of every conversation is louder than the text. Most people aren't in that layer. Not because they can't be, but because their brains aren't built to live there continuously. For the INTJ, it's not a choice. It's the default state. And living there, among people who mostly don't, is genuinely, structurally lonely. Research on individuals with high cognitive complexity and dominant internal processing consistently documents what psychologists call chronic misattunement, the experience of being consistently slightly out of sync with the social environment, not due to social deficits, but due to a fundamental mismatch in depth. This manifests in ways that are deeply familiar to INTJs. The sense of watching life from slightly behind glass. The exhaustion of translating their inner world into language other people can follow. The quiet, low-grade grief of being genuinely known by almost no one. This isn't dysfunction. This is the neurological cost of operating this way. And recognizing it as structural, as built into the wiring rather than as a personal failing, is one of the most liberating things an INTJ can ever understand about themselves. 6. The fire they keep hidden. Now let's talk about what almost nobody gets right about INTJs. Their emotional life. The cultural shorthand is that INTJs don't have feelings, that they're cold, mechanical, indifferent to everything that isn't a problem to be solved. This is one of the most profoundly inaccurate things said about any personality type, and it causes real damage, both to how INTJs are seen and to how they see themselves. INTJs feel. They feel deeply, arguably more intensely than many overtly emotional types, precisely because emotion in the INTJ doesn't flow outward freely, it pools, it builds, it concentrates. Neurologically, the INTJ's exceptionally active prefrontal cortex doesn't suppress emotional experience, it processes it before it reaches expression. Where a feeling-dominant type might experience an emotion and immediately externalize it, the INTJ runs that same emotion through layers of contextual analysis before any of it becomes visible. The emotion doesn't disappear in that process. If anything, it intensifies. The grief of an INTJ runs very deep and very quiet. Their love, once fully given, is architecturally committed in a way most people's simply isn't. The passion they carry for their work and their chosen people burns steadily long after most people's enthusiasm has faded. You just rarely get to see it, because the INTJ has learned, often through painful experience, that expressing that depth creates a vulnerability the world tends to misread. Don't mistake the management for absence. The fire is real, and it's burning hotter than you know. 7. When the oracle misfires. Every gift has a shadow, and the INTJ's shadow is precise and consistent. They can fall in love with their own model. The same neural architecture that makes the INTJ's predictions so accurate can become a closed loop, because the brain that builds a rigorous model of reality also develops a powerful tendency to protect that model. Incoming evidence that contradicts it gets quietly filtered out. Dissenting perspectives start to feel like noise rather than signal. The conclusion hardens from a carefully tested hypothesis into an untouchable certainty. Neuroscience calls this predictive model entrenchment. The brain, having invested significant resources into building a coherent internal architecture, begins treating the model itself as reality. New data is evaluated against the model rather than allowed to update it. 3 failure modes show up reliably. First, model rigidity. The oracle becomes convinced it already has the answer and stops genuinely listening. Second, the human variable blind spot. It excels at modeling systems but underweights how actual, irrational, emotional people will feel and react. Analytically brilliant, practically incomplete. Third, paralysis at the edge of uncertainty. The oracle wants complete data before delivering a verdict, and real life rarely provides it. The fix isn't to doubt the model. It's to audit it regularly and with genuine openness to being wrong. Treat being wrong as data, valuable, necessary data, rather than a failure of intelligence. The oracle that tests itself is the oracle worth listening to. 8. The sharpening that never stops. Here's the most remarkable thing about the INTJ's neurological profile, and one of the most genuinely encouraging. This brain gets better with age. Not in the modest, incremental way most cognitive profiles develop, but compoundingly, substantially, year over year, in ways that turn a sharp young INTJ into something genuinely formidable by midlife. Dominant introverted intuition is an integrative function. It feeds on input and synthesis rather than raw processing speed. The more data the model has been built from, the more predictions checked and refined, the more accurate and nuanced the whole system becomes. The INTJ at 25 has a sharp mind and an incomplete model. The INTJ at 45 has that same sharp mind plus a model tested, corrected, and refined across 2 decades of real-world operation. That's a fundamentally different instrument. Unlike cognitive profiles that peak early and plateau, the INTJ's trajectory runs long. Their pattern recognition becomes faster without becoming shallower. Add the maturation of auxiliary T, extrovert thinking, and you get something the young INTJ often struggles to produce: the ability to explain the vision, to translate deep internal knowing into structured form others can follow. That's when the oracle becomes a teacher. And that's when the gift becomes something the world can actually use. Closing, the weight of knowing. The oracle pattern was never meant to sound like a party trick. It's what naturally happens when a mind gets built to run constant future scenarios, filter signal from noise with real precision, and trust its own internal synthesis over outside confirmation. That gift comes with a real price tag, and it deserves respect rather than mystique. INTJs carrying this pattern aren't fortune tellers. They're pattern recognition specialists running on rare, demanding wiring that trades away ease and small talk in exchange for depth and foresight. If you're an INTJ, stop apologizing for how the machine runs. Constant background processing isn't a bug that needs patching. It's a genuine edge. But foresight needs somewhere to go. Find people who can hear your read on a situation without getting defensive. Build in real rest. The hidden engine doesn't clock out on command, but you can carve out space where it wanders without an agenda. Some of the sharpest oracle-style insights arrive in exactly those unstructured stretches. And let yourself be known. Not to everyone, but to someone. The depth of your emotional life, the weight of what you carry inside that quiet exterior, the fire burning beneath the architecture, it deserves a witness. The oracle who cannot be reached by anyone isn't living fully. They're haunting a life instead of inhabiting it. You saw the wall before anyone else did. You sat with the complexity when everyone else needed a shortcut. That's not a burden you got stuck with. That's the design. And the world, slowly, is beginning to understand what it has in you.